What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. and Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and occasionally on Netflix, as today we're talking the Mr. McMahon docuseries released on Netflix last week, as I'm speaking right now, I believe on Wednesday, September 25th, 2024. I've gotten a lot of questions since the release of the documentary. Have I seen it? What are your thoughts? Is it worth watching? I'm going to try to answer all those questions and much, much more here in this review. I've been waiting to watch the entire thing before actually talking about it in its entirety. We did a first impressions clip on WrestleRant Radio the day after it was released, because I did watch the first two episodes on the day it came out that Wednesday. I watched the next two episodes like a day or two later, and I finished it on Monday, the subsequent Monday. So I have officially caught up. I have caught up on all the memes and the reactions and people's thoughts and the full reviews, and I'm finally getting around myself to talking about it in its entirety. So I did not do scene-by-scene breakdowns of these episodes. I was originally contemplating, if they released it weekly, I was thinking of doing like an episode-by-episode review, because I typically take notes and kind of jot down my thoughts as I watch these things and do a scene-by-scene breakdown, play-by-play commentary, so to speak. I did not do that with this documentary. Honestly, I wanted to pay so much attention to it without having to jot down notes, which is what I typically do, like I said, for like the Peacock releases and the WWE Network content. I always have. I didn't do that with this because I wanted to watch, with complete attention towards what they were talking about, not miss anything. In addition to the fact that it all came out at once. So I feel like, for me anyway, doing an episode-by-episode breakdown wouldn't really be necessary. I'm just kind of going to give you an overview of what each episode's about, which episodes are better than others, and again, as I said earlier, getting back to, is it worth watching? I will say this off the bat. I've had a lot of people, even non-wrestling fans, ask me about this. People I know, friends, family, stuff like that. In my opinion, yes. Honestly, for those people more than even the wrestling fans listening to this, I feel like this documentary is worth watching. I feel like it is worth watching in general for anyone. That's just the wrestling fan in me. I feel like this documentary kind of fails in what it set out to do and what it was marketed as, and getting to know the real Vince McMahon. You find out in the first fucking 30 to 60 seconds when Vince McMahon sits down, and he's all over this documentary, as he should be, because obviously it's supposed to be about him. But the big real hook for this documentary is the fact that Vince is interviewed for it. Is he being completely honest? In some situations, he's a little too honest. In most situations, he's kind of not completely sharing the full story of a lot of situations, and he gives his unfiltered thoughts on a lot of the things they ask him about, and it makes him look a lot worse than anything that the documentary itself would do to make him look worse than he already does to himself, if that makes sense. I kind of jumbled my words there. But what I'm referencing is, a couple days before the documentary came out, Vince McMahon, or his fucking representative, whoever you want to attribute it to, put a statement out on his Twitter account. Now, the guy rarely tweets. I think in the last 2 years alone, he put out a tweet when he, quote-unquote, retired back in the summer of 2022, amidst the initial allegations, and there's been a lot of Vince McMahon allegations in this documentary. The docuseries gets into a lot of it. But he initially retired at that point, tweeted that out. The following year, like around the day after WrestleMania in 2023, he put out it was a tweet, but it was essentially a press release kind of congratulating WWE on being purchased or merging with TKO, UFC, blah, blah, blah. And he was back in the fold, obviously, at that point. And then this tweet from the Monday before the release of the documentary. And he said he had seen it, or at least a partial cut of it, an early cut of it, and he was disappointed in how they portrayed him, and they merged the two characters of Vince and Mr. McMahon. They're the same person. He him fucking self says that they are a lot similar than you would think. And other people in the documentary, even Bruce Pritchard, who might be a bigger Vince McMahon advocate than Vince McMahon himself, even says, yeah, I can kind of see the similarities there, among other people as well. And he really is, like, honestly, as I've discussed with other people in the last week or so, it might honestly be better for him and his own reputation to kind of blame the character and how he's become one and the same. Because for as evil as the Vince McMahon character, the Mr. McMahon character is in WWE TV, or was in his heyday during the Attitude Era and stuff like that, Vince McMahon the person Now we know, with everything that's come out over the course of his life, but especially in the last 9 months, or 10 months really, since that lawsuit was released back in late January of 2024, Vince McMahon, the person, is far more fucking evil than anything we ever saw from Mr. McMahon on WWE TV. And he was responsible for a lot of heinous shit. And for me personally, I know most of Vince's story from what we've heard in other documentaries. Dark Side of the Ring, not Dark Side of the Ring themselves, but I think some of the people that work on Dark Side of the Ring, or at least the same network, Vice, did a 9 Lives of Vince McMahon documentary that I actually reviewed here on the channel, and I wrote down notes during that one 2 years ago. It felt like just a way to capitalize on the Vince McMahon shit going on initially back in 2020, and there was actually some more details about his early childhood than what we got here. And maybe that's because I know I've seen people say in the last week, I think David Shoemaker, who worked on the documentary, he's actually interviewed for the documentary, he's a wrestling analyst, reporter, journalist, what have you. He said that they got 4 hours of footage from Vince where he talked about maybe his early childhood and stuff like that. It might have been one of the first interviews they did with him. They sat down with him for. And it was unusable material because his voice was completely shot. He sounded like a frog and they couldn't use the material. So maybe that's why they don't go too much in depth with his early childhood, because they really gloss over a lot of that stuff. And I feel like that would have been more interesting as opposed to focusing on Hogan versus Andre and some of the other shit like Rock and Hogan. A lot of the stuff they talk about in the documentary is not really relevant to Vince himself. Some of it is, but I think the more interesting stuff for people that were really wondering how evil is this man are the lawsuits they mentioned, specifically in the 2nd episode, the 5th episode, and the last episode. The other episodes are interesting. The first one's a good introductory piece, and they kind of barely scratched the surface on that episode as far as Vince McMahon the person. They just discussed the family business, Hogan being his cash cow in the 80s, how they kind of lied about the attendance about WrestleMania 3. So this is what I'm saying, that sort of shit you would not get in a WWE produced documentary on WrestleMania or on A&E, maybe on A&E actually, but certainly not on the network or on Peacock or whatever. They would leave that shit out. I honestly thought when it came to people fact checking other people that were interviewed for this thing, I thought Dave Meltzer, the famous wrestling journalist, probably the most well-known wrestling journalist there is within the space, and he's just been around for a long time, and his reputation is what it is a lot of the time, but he's been around for a long time and he knows his shit. I honestly thought, for all the flaws that Vince, or not Vince himself, but that Dave Meltzer has, he actually came across the best, probably better than almost anyone else in this documentary. Him and Tony Atlas, who, I don't know where the fuck they found Tony Atlas from. For those unfamiliar, Tony Atlas, and there might be some non-wrestling fans listening to this, which is why I mention all of this for those that might be unaware. Tony Atlas really wasn't that big of a star in WWF, WWF, whatever. He teamed with The Rock's father, Rocky Maivia, or that was High Chief Rocky Maivia. We're talking about, his father, and that was Peter Maivia. We're talking about Rocky Johnson. The Soul Man Rocky Johnson. He had a tag team with Tony Atlas. And, Tony Atlas has had other success in WWE. I don't want to just say his biggest success came at that point. It may have, I don't know. But, he's been in WWE at other points over the years. He managed Mark Henry at one point, and I think he may have done something else. He had, the fucking Abraham Washington show when I first started watching WWE in the late 2000s, early 2010s. But anyway, Tony Atlas isn't, the John Cena of his time. But they interviewed him for this thing, and he had some of the wildest fucking answers, and not in a bad way like other people did. And I'm going to jump all over the place here, but when Brett mentioned they were talking about the Montreal Screwjob, which kind of started the Vince McMahon character, so it was kind of prevalent that they, touched upon that. Brett was like, I initially thought that was their way of getting back at me for leaving for WCW, which was such a wild fucking thing to say. How fucking self-absorbed can you be to think that your brother was killed on purpose, that they wanted to get back at you for leaving for the competition? How fucking stupid is that? Obviously, he doesn't believe that now, and I like Brett a lot. He's very honest, and he comes across well in the documentary. He's actually not quite as aggressive as I thought he was, that I thought he would be. He was actually much more aggressive in the Who Killed WCW documentary that came out on Vice a couple of months ago, earlier this year. That was also enjoyable. That one was even a bigger waste of time. And I enjoyed that documentary. I mentioned here on the show that it was worth watching and whatnot. I broke down each episode. I think this documentary has more access and more interesting answers about WCW than that documentary did. And that one was also worth watching for the one-liners and like the twisted shit that people were thinking, or like their mindsets at that time and even now about the competition and shit. Like hearing Vince's thoughts on it when Vince was asked about, and this wasn't even the wildest shit he said on the entire documentary, but when he was questioned about his tactics in, kind of putting a lot of the territories out of business, or at least accelerating their demise, and the interviewer related it to what WCW was attempting to do to WWF, Vince did not see the similarities at all. He thought that what he did to the territories was fine because that's natural competition, but what WCW was doing to him and rating his talent and whatnot, and really just, they were petty, but WWE was just as petty, and it was just as petty, and they remain petty to this day with some shit. But him not seeing the similarities there was comical. Thinking that, oh yeah, what I did was fine, but WCW rating my talent, they really shouldn't have done that. That was like playing, that was a real low blow to us. They really should not have done that. Like the whole woe is me, WWE always wins, it's our narrative. That was always the narrative with a lot of their documentaries and the shit they put on their own television shows, that we are the heroes, we are the victims, and everyone else is evil, when the most evil motherfucker there is the guy that's in charge of the company. Thankfully, no longer. But like that was one of the one-liners that really stood out to me. The Pat Patterson allegations have never really been confirmed, but Tony Atlas's line about him grabbing him inappropriately, just the way that Tony Atlas says it. It's not, sexual assault is obviously not funny, but the way that he worded it and the editing of it was just hysterical. And that came immediately after Vince was talking about his own father and the, tainted reputation, not reputation, but relationship he had with his own father, Vince McMahon Sr. They immediately cut to Tony Atlas being like, yeah, I don't really think he ever really liked his father, which got a good laugh out of me. It was just the editing on this thing was better than anything else. The editing and the answers from some of these people were just so fucking delusional. Steve Austin saying, again, jumping ahead here to episode 6, they were talking about Benoit. He goes, I'm not a CTE guy, but yeah, I just don't really believe in it. Because he had his own concussion and he doesn't believe that it wasn't, he thinks that maybe people have weaker bodies or minds or whatever. Just a wild fucking thing to say, that you don't believe in CTE. And Vince McMahon, on that same subject of Chris Benoit, who, for those who forgot or just aren't aware, killed his family and killed himself. Killed his wife, killed his 7-year-old or 8-year-old kid, or however old he was, maybe 5 or 6 actually, before killing himself. Vince McMahon says, yeah, he doesn't say that he does say he was a great guy. But he's not like, oh yeah, he was a great guy. But he just kind of sum it up by saying, yeah, people just do wild shit. He just snapped. Like it had nothing to do with the 85-year-old brain that they found in his head when they kind of used it for research. Chris Nowinski did. He used to wrestle for WWE before becoming like an expert on concussions and brains and sports, not just wrestling. And he was like, yeah, I've heard this before. And a lot of, this is well-documented information. He was like, Chris Benoit has the brain of like an 85-year-old with Alzheimer's. And Vince was like, yeah, I don't really think that was why he snapped, though. Like Vince McMahon not taking the slightest bit of responsibility for any of these deaths. And some of these things were accidents. Like Owen Hart was an accident. And yeah, a lot of the responsibility does fall on the talent themselves. But Vince McMahon, in the environment that he kind of cultivated when he was in charge of this company, did not help at all. They go in depth with the steroid trial, which again, for more details on that, check out the Dark Side of the Ring episode that was released a couple of years ago. His whole take on it was interesting, where again, he painted himself out to be the victim, the good guy. He had the fucking neck brace on, and I don't know if he dismissed it here, or if it was someone else kind of saying, yeah, he wouldn't do that on purpose, like he had neck surgery. Why wouldn't he wear a neck brace? Not knowing that Vince McMahon is the least vulnerable person of all fucking time. The man was he was walking around with a cane recently in public, and even then he probably did that to kind of rehab his public image, like, oh, woe is me, I'm a, weak, feeble old man, don't kind of shit on me for all the shit that I've done. Like, fuck you. Honestly, like, fuck you. And it kind of came across that same way 30 years ago in the steroid trial as well, when they covered that and that whole shit. So, yeah, that was interesting. They go into a lot about, like, the competition with WCW and, again, a lot of things that really don't have to do with Vince as a person And Vince is a person with a lot of the stories they share here is just not a great person. It's just as blatant as that. And there are some nice stories shared, like even Bruce Pritchard says at the very end, which was also aged like fucking fine wine. When he goes, yeah, I've seen early parts of this doc. It's like, of this documentary that we're talking about. It feels like a gotcha piece, like they just shit all over him. And then literally the next day or two after that interview was recorded, the lawsuit's released about Vince McMahon being just a vile human being and how, you know, he's a piece of shit and the rape allegations, the sex trafficking with Janelle Grant, who's obviously not interviewed for this thing. People are wondering, why wouldn't she be in it? They obviously talk about the situation and they interview the reporters that broke the news, which was cool. They don't interview her. Why would she partake in a fucking documentary about this person that she's going to be in a lawsuit with? I mean, I know it's not Vince McMahon. It's his documentary, really. I know it's also shitting on him. And for those wondering, is it like anti-Vince? I mean, it is. I mean, it also lays out the facts. I think this documentary, for the most part, does a good job of covering all the facts. Like when they said that Owen Hart's blood was still in the ring, I think Dave Meltzer said that, which is comical because he's supposed to be like the fact checker of this documentary. I don't think that was true. I don't think Owen Hart's blood was in the ring. I think that was from another angle on that show at Over the Edge 99. Moving on with that show, despite the fact the guy died in the ring, was just, again, we've discussed it at length with the Dark Side of the Ring review and just in general, but even 25 years later, it's still fucking like crazy that they did that. It was a goddamn crime scene. And they moved on with it. Vince's mindset, again, not even the craziest shit he said in this documentary, but he was like, yeah, I would have to move. Like, why wouldn't we move on? Like, the show's got to go on. Like, what are you, like, you're fucking mental. You are delusional. I think the one that takes the cake, though, was when he said about, I believe it was the female referee that came out and said that Vince McMahon sexually assaulted her and whatnot. He at one point said, not in this doc, but years ago, saying that it never actually happened. But he says in this documentary, liars cannot keep their story straight. He says here that it did actually happen, but it was consensual. And if it was, he literally says this, not word for word, but he basically says, but if it wasn't consensual, the statute of limitations are up anyway, so it doesn't matter. Why the fuck would you say that? Like, that was wild. My jaw dropped to the floor when I heard him fucking say that. Again, this is what I'm saying. And it's not like they cut up Vince's answer where he's like, statute, limitation. Like that sort of thing where they take words out of context. It's him, word for word, unedited, saying all that shit. Why the fuck would you say that? That is terrible. That is terrible. So, again, going back to what I said earlier, no one makes Vince look worse in this doc than Vince McMahon himself. And it's fucking wild. Like, people have said this on Twitter since its release amongst the wrestling community, that, like, a lot of the people he brought in, Hogan, Vince, Rock, Trish, they all say, like, he was like a father figure to me. He was like a father figure to me. He gave me so many opportunities. They're all indebted to this man. And honestly, like, that's nice. I've never worked for Vince McMahon. I don't have that relationship with him. I've never fucking met the guy. So I can't say for sure. But I feel like Vince, whether it was intentional or unintentional or whatever, he had such a tainted, by his own words, like not a great relationship with his own father, who was extremely tough on him. And he has that relationship now with Shane. Shane is interviewed for this thing. Linda is interviewed for this thing. And it's odd that maybe she just didn't want to be asked about it. They don't even include the footage of her saying, like, no comment. Like, these interviews were from 2021 onward. I should have said that earlier. And the Shane one specifically, they talk about his own father relationship. I'll finish up on that point before we go into the interview stuff, about when they were filmed and whatnot. I'm all over the place here. I apologize. But they mention with the father figure stuff, like Vince kind of been, he's such a great manipulator. Like, and people have said it's difficult working for the man. I have a love-hate relationship for Vince because he gave me an opportunity, but like he can be such a piece of shit. Like Mick Foley, like fucking loves the guy, he said recently. But he hated his time working on commentary because as a boss, he was fucking awful back in like the late 2000s, at least by that point, working on commentary, hearing Vince screaming in your ear. It was tough, and their relationship, he said, by his own words, never really recovered after he went to TNA for a couple of years. But yeah, Vince has this stronghold on the talent where it's very difficult for a lot of these people to acknowledge Vince for being the terrible person that he is. John Cena even saying in interviews in the last year, we all have our flaws. I mean, I sound like Vince when I say that, like the way that I did, but Vince was like, we're all flawed in our own way. I love him for the man that I know him as, blah, blah, blah. Like, bro, I know he gave you an opportunity. I know you wouldn't be the star that you are without him, blah, blah, blah. But let's just acknowledge that it can be or has been to other people, maybe not to you, a terrible fucking person. Acknowledge the victims. Acknowledge all that shit. I mean, yeah, maybe could there be cases of some of the women exaggerating or whatever? I mean, anything's possible. But like the amount of shit that has come out in the last decades, 30 years, 40 years, whatever, about this man, but specifically recently, there is fucking proof of it in texts. And even if you want to say about the Janelle Grant thing, she went along with it for years. I've heard that one how many times? Oh yeah, she went along with it. She took the money, blah, blah, blah. Again, there's a case that can be made for certain things, but the fact that Vince was doing what he did, passing her along to other employees, and the way that he was talking about this woman that was 50 years his junior rather, that was 50 years her senior, I guess you could say, is fucking disgusting for a 77, 78-year-old man. Just inexcusable behavior for like the chairman of a company. This isn't like just exclusive to WWE. This is an issue in a lot of businesses and culture and whatnot. But just, we're talking about Vince specifically here. That shit was just disgusting. And they talk about a lot of it here and whatnot. It's just wild. But again, going back to the interviews, I forgot to finish that thought from earlier. All the interviews were filmed from 2021 onward. The Bruce Pritchard one, where he made that comment, where he called it a gotcha piece, was from January, 2 days before the lawsuit dropped. Like, the timing on that was fucking impeccable. The rest of the other interviews where they kind of defend Vince, they also couldn't really come up for words where they discuss his legacy, because he did, like, you cannot take away what he's done for WWE. We would probably not be here talking about this doc in wrestling in general if it wasn't for Vince McMahon. That is true. The man is a wrestling genius, whatever you want to call him. But he's also just a terrible human being. Again, you can blame it on his childhood and other circumstances that he's had to live with and endure over the course of his life and whatnot. But at his core, for decades, it's not like he got over it and he's a better person now. This was going on up until recent years, up until like a fucking year or two ago. He left the company, wormed his way back in. Like, the whole dramatics of it is just insane, which is why, for that shit alone, this documentary is worth watching. And it's funny seeing how people talk about Vince before all of that shit came out about him in the last couple of years. You don't hear anything damning about Vince from The Rock or John Cena. They are the two most political people on this entire documentary. Even Bruce Pritchard has some better quotes about Vince than they do. But they interviewed Stone Cold, like I said. Taker's got a lot of good quotes. He comes across pretty rationally. That was another one I forgot. When Vince was like, oh yeah, he wasn't concussed. He just was still in shock from me telling him that his streak was going to end at WrestleMania 30, and that's why he doesn't remember most of the match. Like, what are you fucking saying? That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And Taker even said that Vince was at the hospital. He left Mania to accompany Taker to the hospital, but yet he was okay. He just forgot the finish, pal. He forgot the rest of the match. Like, what are you fucking talking about? Hearing Vince's perspective, for wrestling fans, hearing Vince's perspective on things and the dumb way that he twists the narrative in a lot of situations is the most must-see thing about this doc. You will learn very little new information if you are a wrestling fan. If you're not, you will learn a lot, and it's fucking fascinating. Which is why, it's a different topic altogether. But that's why I recommend, like, The Iron Claw. Is that historically accurate? It's a lot less historically accurate than this. But it's a great movie based on an actual wrestling family that did have a lot of struggles, and everyone that I talked to loved that movie. That, among other projects that have come out over the years. This one's a little bit different because it's not like a fake, representation of what happened. It's not a movie, it's a documentary. It's only 6 episodes, hour each. You can get through it either within a day or a couple days, or if you have a lot less time than maybe a week like I did. Mine took me about 5 days to watch the whole thing. But it really is interesting because you will not get to know the real Vince McMahon. I think that is what makes this documentary not worth watching, but my top takeaway from it is that if you were going into it expecting to see these real, honest answers from Vince, you're not going to get that. You're going to get a lot of stupid answers that he clearly did not think of before he said them, which is funny because you would think that he would be better prepared for this shit even before all the, lawsuits dropped and whatnot. Obviously, he canceled his final interview with Netflix when the initial lawsuit came out it wasn't the lawsuit, but like the allegations about it back in 2022. No shit, he wasn't going to complete the documentary at that point. But like the fact he even tried to buy this thing is fucking crazy. I mean, it's not crazy because it's really expected of Vince to do that. But guess what? He's not the be-all, end-all anymore. The end-all, be-all. He's just another person like the rest of us. He doesn't work. I mean, obviously, I'm not a fucking billionaire like Vince McMahon is, but what I mean is he doesn't have the same power that he used to. As the head of WWE, thinking that he was invincible. No one can touch me or my image. No one can tarnish me or blah, blah, blah. I beat the government. I beat all these rape allegations, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? Life has a way of catching up to all of us, especially Vince McMahon. And honestly, for all the people that say he should just fucking die and all this other sort of stuff, I'll just say this on that front. At least he lived to see the day that he saw his reputation, which was already tarnished anyway, get fucking ruined and get ousted from his own company. That is how bad this situation is. If he just died and there was like this big funeral for him on WWE TV, it would have been a sad ordeal, and it would have been a big... It will still be a big deal when he dies, and I'm sure they'll obviously acknowledge it on the shows. He'll never be back in person, I don't think. I think those days are done. Those days are dead. But he will not go out in grace the way that he would have 5 years ago. I mean, the product was fucking ass 5 years ago, but if Vince McMahon died, it would have been a massive deal. People would have been sad and whatnot. But with everything that's come out, thankfully, while he's still alive, he gets to see the company that he loves and built from, not from scratch, he took it from his father, given to someone else. His son-in-law, Nick Khan, these other people that he doesn't hate those people, I don't think, but they're doing shit that he would have never done, that he would have fucking hated to see, that he probably still hates seeing if he hears about it, if he still follows the product, who knows, who cares. But at least he lived long enough to see his name get completely ruined justifiably. Because, it's about time that life caught up with this piece of shit. But anyway, in closing here, I enjoyed the documentary. This has been said a million times. I said it myself earlier. You will learn nothing new from watching this if you are a wrestling fan. The shit they talk about from like the Attitude Era, they talk about like the Trish barking angle, the Linda angle, just wild shit. Like Vince saying, oh yeah, no one was bothered by it. Shane saying, yeah, I was bothered by it. Got a good laugh at it. The editing there was great. Stephanie's comments on this thing were interesting, I think it was an interview from like a decade ago. She got asked about Mike Tyson's involvement with WWE, and the interviewer asked her, like, oh, were there any reservations about bringing in Tyson in light of his rape allegations? And she turns to someone off screen and says, did we know about that at that point? Had that happened? That happened afterward, right? And they said, no, it happened before. Like, that was kind of awkward and embarrassing. They talk about the women's revolution in WWE. They talk about the product becoming ass in the years that followed, going PG, building stars like Cena, Rock, and Stone Cold. I think it's a great retrospective of WWE itself. Like, not just Vince, which is what this stuff... that's where it fails, is really giving us the real picture of Vince, which is what we were kind of hoping for. We don't get that, because he won't allow us to see within the real Vince. He never will, and he'll die before he does. Those stories, this is my top takeaway. The biggest and greatest stories that, not even greatest, but like the most vile shit, he will take those stories to the grave. He will die with the truth. He just doesn't tell the truth. I think Hulk Hogan might be one of the only people in wrestling that lies more than Vince McMahon does. But I think even more than Hogan's just a liar, but I think with Vince, he's just such a massive, not brilliant, that's far from the right word I would use, but he's like very good at manipulating. Like he excels at that. He is proficient at manipulating people. And that comes across in this documentary, the way that he talks about certain shit. It's crazy. But yeah, they talk about all the different angles and the rise of WrestleMania, how it was a risk, and the territories in WCW, and there's like one mention of AEW towards the end. Yeah, again, I would show this documentary to anyone that is curious about Vince and his story. That's really what's worth watching for. But honestly, if you want like a quick summary, And I say quick, it's 6 hours if you watch them all back to back to back to back to back to back. If you want a quick summary of the history of WWE, the biggest storylines, moments, transitions, and where they are today, this is the documentary I would show someone. Honestly, and it kind of paints wrestling in a weird picture because they were responsible for so many vile things. Like, it's honestly like not even funny, but it's just crazy at the end of every single episode where they talk about all these different lawsuits, even the Sable one they mentioned, when he somehow doesn't have any memory of that, or where they mention the incest angle. Oh yeah, he remembers that, and he fucking laughs about it too. Stephanie doesn't want to talk about it. He wants to talk about it. They didn't do it, thank God, but he was willing to do it. He wanted to put Triple H and Stephanie's wedding on TV. They said no. So instead, he booked himself in a match with Stephanie on pay-per-view where he beat the shit out of her on pay-per-view at No Mercy 03, I think, 6 days before her actual wedding. Again, just insane shit. But with Vince, I kind of forgot what I was even saying there. I know I've been rambling now for a while, and I'll wind it down here. But all those stories are going to die with him. And if you want to see how vile of a human being he actually is, this is the documentary for you. And even then, some of this shit is not completely discussed in detail, which I would have rather preferred over like, oh, let's talk about Hogan and Andre. But honestly, as far as that stuff goes, it's cool to see it represented on a major platform such as Netflix. So I can recommend this to family members, to friends that aren't really aware of wrestling or haven't watched in a long time. Whether you're a old fan, ex-fan, returning fan, not a fan at all, I would still recommend this documentary. I think it's a fascinating look at one of the most successful promoter in wrestling history, but one of the most successful promoters in all of entertainment and sports, quite honestly, and how his name has been turned to mud because of his own actions, and he only has himself to blame. Thank you guys for checking out my review of Mr. McMahon on Netflix. Check it out now. They're not paying me to promote it or whatever. I'm just saying I would implore you to check it out. Let me know what you think on this video. Hit me up on social media. If you watch this review or watch the documentary, do you agree? Do you disagree? I would appreciate your feedback and support. Thank you guys for checking out all the stuff here on the channel, daily content. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, share the video, drop a comment like I said. All that stuff is greatly appreciated. We also have an all-new Pro Wrestling Tees store available right now over at ProWrestlingTees.com/WrestleRant. Support the brand, support the show, support what I do. I would greatly appreciate it by buying a shirt today. Have an awesome one, folks. I'm Graham G. Matthews. Thank you again for checking out this review, and I'll catch your ass down the road.